The guitar case was battered leather, scarred from 1,000 road miles and 10,000 stage lights. Inside, beneath the spare strings and crumpled set lists, Johnny Cash kept a letter he'd written 20 years earlier. The envelope had yellowed with time. The ink faded at the edges, but the words inside remained as sharp as the day he'd put them on paper. He'd carried it through every tour, every triumph, every collapse. He'd never mailed it. He never would. Because some truths are easier to sing to strangers than to whisper to the person who deserved to hear them most. The world knew Johnny Cash as the man in black, the voice of outcasts and prisoners, the rebel who sang about darkness with such authority that people assumed he'd made peace with his own. They were wrong. Inside that guitar case, folded into quarters and hidden like contraband, was evidence of the one wound he could never cauterize with music. A letter to Vivian, his first wife, the woman who'd loved him before the world knew his name, before the fame, before everything that came after destroyed what they'd built in the quiet spaces between his early dreams. He'd written it in 1968, 7 years after their divorce, sitting alone in a hotel room in Detroit at 3 a.m. The show had gone well. The crowd had roared, and in the silence that followed the applause, in that hollow space where validation should have lived, he felt the absence of the only person whose approval had ever actually mattered. So he'd written the letter he should have written a decade earlier, when there might still have been time to save what they had. But by 1968, it was far too late for salvation. The letter became a confession with no recipient, an apology that would never reach the person it was meant for. What the letter said, Johnny never told anyone. Not June Carter, his second wife, though she likely suspected its existence. Not his children, though they would one day understand the weight their father carried. Not his closest friends or his pastor or the journalists who tried to excavate every corner of his mythology. The contents remained locked inside that envelope, sealed with the kind of finality that comes from knowing some words lose their power the moment they're spoken aloud. But the songs he wrote afterward, the rawness that entered his voice, the particular ache that colored his performances of love songs and lost songs and everything in between, those carried traces of what the letter contained. Before there was a letter, there was a girl waiting at a skating rink in San Antonio, Texas. The year was 1951, and Johnny Cash was nobody. Just another young man in an Air Force uniform, stationed at Lackland Base, trying to figure out what came next in a life that felt simultaneously full of potential and completely directionless. He'd grown up picking cotton in Arkansas, the son of a sharecropper, so poor that ambition felt like a luxury his family couldn't afford. But something in him refused to accept that a life of manual labor and quiet desperation was inevitable. Vivian was 17, dark-haired and beautiful, with a certainty about herself that both intimidated and attracted him. She came from a stable Italian-American family, the kind of middle-class respectability that felt like a different universe to a boy who'd never owned a new pair of shoes until he joined the military. They met at a roller skating rink, introduced by mutual friends, and Johnny knew immediately that she represented something he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching. Stability. Home. A reason to believe that the future could be different from the past. But the real story was never only about falling in love. It was about what love meant to someone who'd never had anything solid to hold on to. Vivian became his anchor before he understood how desperately he needed one, and that dependency would eventually become the thing that made their relationship impossible to sustain. They married in 1954, 3 weeks after Johnny's discharge from the Air Force. He was 22. She was 19. They moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where Johnny got a job selling appliances door to door, while secretly nurturing a dream that seemed absurd even to himself. He wanted to make music. Not as a hobby or a side project, but as a life. He'd been writing songs since he was 12, scribbling lyrics on scraps of paper during slow days in the cotton fields. But wanting something and believing you could actually achieve it were different territories entirely. Vivian believed in him when he couldn't yet believe in himself. She worked as a secretary to supplement his meager sales commissions. She encouraged him when he came home defeated after another day of rejection and closed doors. She sat up late listening to him work through melodies on a cheap guitar, offering feedback even though neither of them knew anything about the music business. And when Johnny finally got an audition at Sun Records in 1955, Vivian was the one who ironed his best shirt and told him to walk in there like he already belonged. The audition changed everything, though not immediately in ways that felt like success. Sam Phillips, the legendary producer who'd discovered Elvis Presley, heard something in Johnny's voice. A darkness, an authenticity, a refusal to sound like anyone else. He signed Johnny to a contract, and suddenly the impossible dream had a toehold in reality. But reality, it turned out, was more complicated than the dream had suggested. Success in the music industry in the 1950s meant constant touring, weeks and months away from home, grinding through one-night stands in towns that blurred together into an endless highway of dive bars and small-time radio stations. Johnny threw himself into it with the desperation of someone who'd been poor too long to risk losing this opportunity. Every show mattered. Every radio appearance was a chance to build momentum. He couldn't afford to say no to any gig, any interview, any chance to push his music further into the world's consciousness. And Vivian stayed home, pregnant with their first daughter, watching her husband disappear into a career that was simultaneously making him famous and making him a stranger. The letters they wrote to each other during those early touring years were lifelines, attempts to maintain connection across the growing distance. Johnny would send long, romantic letters from the road, describing the shows and the audiences, but also his loneliness, his need for her, his promises that all of this would be worth it eventually. Vivian would write back with news from home, small domestic details that he clung to like proof that he still belonged somewhere beyond the transient world of touring musicians. But letters, no matter how frequent or heartfelt, couldn't bridge the gap that was forming between the man who left for tours and the man who returned. By 1956, Johnny Cash had his first hit with I Walk the Line, a song ostensibly about fidelity and commitment, a promise to remain true despite temptation and distance. The irony of that song's meaning versus the reality of his life would become more apparent as the years progressed. The success of I Walk the Line meant more touring, bigger venues, higher stakes. It meant Johnny was becoming a commodity, a brand, a public figure who belonged to audiences before he belonged to himself or his family. What the audiences heard was beauty. What Vivian experienced was absence. The distance wasn't just physical. There was an emotional separation growing, born from the fundamental incompatibility between the life Johnny was building and the life Vivian had signed up for. She'd married a struggling appliance salesman with musical aspirations, not a touring celebrity who was home maybe 3 months out of every year. And Johnny, for his part, was discovering that fame didn't fill the emptiness inside him the way he'd assumed it would. If anything, the applause made the quiet moments feel more hollow, the spaces between shows more unbearable. By the late 1950s, Johnny had started using amphetamines to keep up with the punishing tour schedule. The pills helped him stay awake during long drives between cities, helped him perform night after night without rest, helped him function on 3 hours of sleep and adrenaline. They also made him irritable, paranoid, emotionally volatile. The gentle, romantic young man Vivian had married was being replaced by someone harder, angrier, less accessible. And when he came home between tours, he brought that darkness with him. The drugs were a secret at first, something Johnny could hide from everyone, including himself, behind rationalizations about professional necessity. But addiction doesn't stay hidden. It metastasizes, consuming progressively larger portions of the person until the substance becomes the organizing principle of their entire existence. Johnny's behavior became erratic. He'd disappear for days during tours, miss scheduled performances, show up to recording sessions unable to focus. The music was still brilliant. Songs like Ring of Fire and Folsom Prison Blues proved his creative genius remained intact. But the man creating the music was fragmenting. Vivian tried everything she knew how to try. She confronted him about the pills. She begged him to slow down, to prioritize family over career, to remember the person he'd been before the fame. She threatened to leave, hoping the ultimatum would shock him into change. Nothing worked. Because Johnny was fighting battles that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with demons he couldn't articulate even to himself. The applause was real. So was the silence afterward. And he didn't know how to exist in that silence without chemical intervention. There were moments during those dark years when Johnny would come home between tours and see his daughters playing in the yard, and something would crack open inside him. A glimpse of the life he was missing, the father he wasn't being, the husband he'd promised to be but couldn't seem to embody. He'd make promises to himself and to Vivian, promises to slow down, to get clean, to be present. And for a few days, sometimes even a few weeks, he'd manage it. He'd be the man she'd married, attentive and gentle and fully there. Then the road would call again, or the silence would become too loud, and he'd reach for the pills that made everything feel manageable again. Vivian learned to recognize the pattern. The brief returns to himself, followed by the inevitable slide back into absence. She stopped believing the promises because believing them and watching them break was more painful than accepting the reality that this was who he'd become. She focused on raising their daughters, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, and Tara, trying to create stability in a home where their father was more myth than man, more absence than presence. The children grew up with a strange relationship to their father's fame. They'd hear his voice on the radio singing about love and loss, and it would sound like a stranger performing emotions he couldn't express in their living room. They'd see him on television, charismatic and commanding, and wonder where that version of their father went when he came home exhausted and distant. The disconnect between the public Johnny Cash and the private one created a kind of emotional vertigo that would take them years to understand and decades to reconcile. By 1966, their marriage had become a performance almost as exhausting as Johnny's stage shows. They maintained appearances for the sake of their 4 daughters, went through the motions of family dinners and holidays, pretended that everything was fine while the foundation crumbled beneath them. Vivian later described those final years as watching someone drown while being too exhausted to keep throwing them life preservers they wouldn't grab anyway. The divorce was finalized in 1967, and Johnny immediately began a public relationship with June Carter, the woman who would become his second wife and the great love story the world would remember. The narrative was clean, almost redemptive. Troubled man finds saving grace through the love of a good woman. June helped Johnny get sober, helped him find his way back to stability, helped him become the legend the world would celebrate. But that narrative erased Vivian. It made her a footnote in Johnny's story, the starter wife who couldn't handle the pressure, rather than the woman who'd believed in him when he was nothing and supported him through his early rise before he became someone she no longer recognized. And that was where the distance began. Sitting in that Detroit hotel room in 1968, watching his new life with June unfold exactly the way his old life with Vivian should have, Johnny finally understood what he'd lost. Not just a marriage, but the only version of himself that had felt genuinely whole. Vivian had known him before fame complicated everything, before the drugs and the persona and the mythology. She'd loved the sharecropper's son with impossible dreams, not the man in black with a carefully constructed image. And in choosing his career over that love, in letting addiction destroy what they'd built, he'd lost access to the person he might have been. The letter poured out of him in the early morning hours, 3,000 words of apology and confession and grief. He wrote about the man he'd been when they met, the promises he'd made and failed to keep, the ways addiction had stolen his ability to show up for the people who mattered most. He wrote about watching their daughters grow up through the distorted lens of partial custody and scheduled visits, about knowing he'd failed them in ways that couldn't be repaired. He wrote about understanding, too late, that Vivian had been right about almost everything. Right to worry about the touring, right to fear what fame would do to him, right to eventually walk away when staying became its own form of destruction. But he also wrote about the impossibility of going back, about how you can recognize your mistakes without being able to undo them. He wrote about June and the new life he was building, acknowledging that it was built partially on the rubble of what he and Vivian had destroyed together. He wrote about the particular cruelty of finding clarity after the opportunity for redemption has passed, about living with the weight of choices that can't be unmade. When he finished writing, as dawn light began filtering through the hotel curtains, Johnny read the letter 3 times. Each reading made it clearer that sending it would be an act of selfishness disguised as honesty. What would it accomplish except to transfer his guilt onto Vivian, asking her to carry some of his burden? She'd moved on with her life. She'd remarried. She was building something new from the wreckage of what they'd had. The letter would only pull her back into pain she'd worked hard to leave behind. So he sealed the envelope and put it in his guitar case, tucking it beneath the interior pocket where it would stay hidden but always present. He never mailed it because mailing it would have been about his need for absolution, not her need for peace. The letter stayed sealed, and Johnny carried it like physical evidence of the cost of becoming who he was. The songs he wrote afterward carried traces of what that letter contained. Hurt, recorded near the end of his life, with its devastating meditation on regret and irreversible damage. I Still Miss Someone, with its admission that longing doesn't respect the neat boundaries of new relationships and fresh starts. The rawness in his voice when he sang about loss, the particular ache that suggested he wasn't just performing emotion, but channeling it from somewhere deep and real. And that was the moment the story changed. The letter transformed from a private confession into the emotional engine that powered his most honest work. Every love song became complicated by the knowledge of love he'd failed to preserve. Every redemption narrative was shadowed by the understanding that some things remain broken no matter how much grace you find. Johnny Cash performed for millions over the next 3 decades, married to June, sober and productive, creating the legendary body of work that would cement his place in music history. But he never stopped carrying that letter, never threw it away, never forgot what it represented. It became a kind of spiritual practice, a daily reminder that becoming legendary requires sacrifices most people never see and costs that can't be calculated in album sales or sold-out shows. During the recording sessions for his American Recordings albums in the 1990s, producer Rick Rubin noticed that Johnny would sometimes open his guitar case and touch the old envelope before beginning a take. Rubin never asked about it, sensing that whatever it represented was too private for questions. But he observed that the songs Johnny recorded after those moments had a particular depth, a quality of emotional nakedness that went beyond technical performance into something closer to confession. The letter had become a kind of talisman, a reminder of who Johnny had been and what he'd lost in the process of becoming who he was. It kept him honest in a business built on manufactured personas and careful image management. It grounded him when the mythology threatened to replace the man. It whispered that beneath all the accolades and achievements was someone who'd failed the people who mattered most, and no amount of success could erase that fundamental truth. When Johnny died in 2003, 4 months after June's death, his children found the letter while going through his possessions. They made the decision not to read it, not to open what their father had chosen to keep sealed. They understood instinctively that the letter's power lay not in its specific words, but in what it represented: acknowledgement of a wound that couldn't heal, an apology that couldn't be delivered, a truth that could only be carried in silence. Roseanne Cash, Johnny's eldest daughter, later spoke about finding the letter in interviews, though never about its contents. She described it as evidence of her father's capacity for self-reflection and regret, proof that the man in black persona didn't erase the vulnerable human underneath. The letter became, for his children, a symbol of complexity. Their father was both the legend the world celebrated and the flawed man who carried private sorrows he couldn't resolve. Vivian Liberto died in 2005, never knowing the letter existed, never receiving the apology it contained. Maybe that was mercy. Maybe she didn't need Johnny's regret added to her own memories of those years. She'd built a good life after their divorce, found happiness and stability in ways that had been impossible during their marriage. The letter would have complicated that narrative, reopened questions that had finally found answers in distance and time. The legacy of that October night is not just Johnny's survival, but the reminder that we all have the power to face our darkest truths, even when we can't share them with anyone else. We don't need to mail every letter we write or speak every apology we compose. Sometimes the act of acknowledging our failures privately, of carrying the weight of what we've done without asking for absolution, is the most honest form of penance. Johnny Cash sang about heartbreak for 50 years, but there was one heartbreak he could never turn into a song. So he wrote a letter instead, sealed it, and carried it until the end. And in that carrying, in that daily confrontation with his own fallibility, he found something that looked like wisdom, even if it never quite reached forgiveness. The Man in Black gave the world songs that felt like memories, even to people who'd never met him. Now we know why. Because behind every anthem of longing and loss was a man who understood exactly what it meant to lose something irreplaceable through choices that seemed inevitable at the time, but unbearable in retrospect. That's the real story of the letter Johnny Cash never sent. Not what it said, but what it meant to carry it. To wake up every morning and remember that some damage can't be repaired, only acknowledged. Some apologies can't be delivered, only lived with. Some costs of greatness can't be calculated in public terms, but only measured in private moments of regret that no audience will ever witness. He gave people songs to gather around, even when he himself carried distance inside. The warmth in the music did not always mean life felt warm. What people called timeless often began as something deeply personal. And sometimes the most important words are the ones we write but never send, the confessions we carry in silence, the truths we acknowledge only to ourselves in the space between applause and the long drive home.